Thank you very much for being in attendance today. This is our final session of Wage and Hour Management Training, or Fair Labor Standards Act training. I'm Tricia Wooten from the Office of Institutional Compliance, and I'd like to welcome you. I'd also like to tell you a couple of housekeeping things. Some of you may have noticed that you've already been assigned this course in the online learning portal, the ELM. We are manually giving you all credit for attending. If you are watching in our web streaming process currently, we don't have your roster of attendance, so you must go into the online learning portal and complete the attestation to show that you attended via web streaming today. Those of you here in the auditorium, we will manually give you credit. Okay, make sense? All right. For those of you that are observing this later, we are recording this session to be placed in the online learning portal for individuals to complete within the next 30 days. You will also need to complete the attestation if you are observing this on the ELM. It is my pleasure to welcome David Jordan for our 6th session of FLSA training. We were in Angleton earlier and made our way here as quickly as possible from training some folks in Angleton. David is an attorney with Littler Mendelson. He's an expert regarding employment law. He has had some very interesting cases, which he'll discuss with you today. He's been named one of America's top attorneys for 3 years. He's a Texas Rising Star attorney for multiple years as well. He was educated in Oklahoma, and it is my pleasure to welcome him to our stage. So thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We'll see if you applaud when I'm done. Thanks for coming. I know this has been the high point of your schedule all week. You've been counting down the days and the hours, and we're finally here. So thank you for coming to Wage and Hour Management Training. Sure you guys are excited about it. We're going to talk about wages. We're going to talk about hours. We're going to talk about how to manage those issues. We'll make it more exciting than it sounds, I promise. So let's talk a little bit about what we're really here to do today. So a quick primer on what I mean when I say wage and hour. And it starts with the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act is a federal law that was enacted in the Depression era to put more people to work. The idea was there aren't enough people working. There's too many unemployed. Let's punish employers for not hiring more people. And they did that by saying, first of all, we're going to have a minimum wage of $7.25. I still remember when it was $3.35 when I was working at Burger King. Anybody remember it lower than $3.35? Am I the oldest guy in the room? Okay, there's a few that are older. But today it's $7.25. It may go up more in the next few years if we don't see changes in the party control in the White House. The Fair Labor Standards Act also requires the payment of overtime, which is 1.5 times the regular rate. And I didn't say the hourly rate, I said the regular rate. I'll talk about what that means later. For all hours worked over 40 in a work week. We're going to talk about what all those words mean. Primarily, we're going to talk about what I mean by exemptions. That is, can you be exempt from overtime? Many of you in this room are. And I'll talk about a little bit about what that means. And we're going to talk about what I mean by hours worked versus something that does not work. I'll describe the regular rate a little bit. You'll know what I mean and how I do the math. And then we'll talk about the work week. We're also excited to announce, right, drum roll, 2 brand new policies. I know policies are hard to come by here at UTMB, right? So we've been working really hard, HR and payroll and legal and compliance and everyone else. But a lot of you in here have put together 2 great policy documents. They're going to help you do your job. The timekeepers here, the managers here. One is a policy about employee time card management. It gives you greater clarity of your employees' roles with regards to time card management and your roles. And we'll talk a little about that policy later on in the presentation. The second policy document talks about compensation, and it guides us as to what is work and not work as it relates to non-exempt employees. That is, employees that are not exempt from overtime. They are allowed to receive overtime and required to do so under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So let's talk about really the reason I'm here, and that's to reduce the exposure and liability to UTMB in the state. And I do that by teaching you about the rules. There's really three types of liability that really we're worried about here. The first is liability for not paying overtime. That's required under the Fair Labor Standards Act. How might that happen? Well, there's really three ways we could not pay overtime. The first is that we misclassify someone as exempt. Maybe some of you in this room really ought to be someone that is not exempt from overtime. And if you are, then all those hours you work over 40 ought to be paid at 1.5 times. I wish I was not exempt from overtime, right? So that's the first way that liability can exist. And those classification decisions are made by HR and payroll with assistance from other people at the university. The second is, and third, the second is perhaps our managers are directing employees not to pay, not to work overtime, right? We're not going to pay overtime. I need you to work anyway. Perhaps there's an employer out there, not UTMB, that says we're just not going to pay overtime to our employees. We're just going to pay them straight time. That's the second type of liability. The third, you see it up here, is we miscalculate the overtime. We do the math wrong, and I'll explain what the math is. The second type of liability is not paying minimum wage. It's not really a problem we have here because most of our employees are paid well over $7.25 an hour. And the third is not paying for all hours worked. And we'll spend a long time today talking about what's work and what's not and how we're going to pay it. But let's step into the exemptions for just a minute so that we all understand the difference. Again, if you fall under one of these exemptions, you are exempt from the requirement of UTMB to pay overtime. The rest of the presentation today, we're going to talk about employees that are not exempt and our responsibilities with regards to non-exempt employees. But with regards to these, let me talk about the 6 exemptions, give you some clarity. There's 6 types. The first is the executive exemption. And the executive exemption probably covers most of you in here. If your primary duty is management and you supervise 2 or more employees full-time, and you're paid at least $455 a week, that's what they call the salary basis test, you are exempt from overtime. We get to work you all we want. Right? Fun, right? You spend all your life trying to achieve these great things. The administrative exemption, there's a lot of confusion sometimes about this exemption. It covers back office work, HR, accounting, safety, quality control. Has the same requirement of $455 a week, but it's not every administrative employee. It's only those employees that exercise independent judgment and discretion, and those are legal terms of art for which millions of dollars is spent litigating, and that judgment and discretion is in matters of significance. Right? So it's not where do you pick up lunch and for the meeting for the executive. It's important stuff, right? Choosing comprehensive vendors, making decisions about policies, writing these 2 policies that we have. High-level administrative employees. So your accounting clerk, probably not exempt, but maybe your VP of HR definitely is. There's the professional exemption. The doctors in the room and the lawyers, those that have gone through a prolonged course of study, those persons are exempt from overtime. There's a computer exemption. And I don't mean like your help desk guy, right, who comes and plugs in a few wires in the computer. These are people that are involved in significant development of hardware or software systems. High-level computer professionals, they're exempt from overtime. There's an outside sales exemption. Probably not a lot of door-to-door salesmen here, but if you happen to be one for UTMB and you're knocking on businesses and doors every day outside the office, you can be exempt from overtime and the minimum wage. Yippee. Then finally, there's the Motor Carrier Act, right? Do you drive a 10,000-pound truck to and from various places in a given day? You can be exempt from overtime there. Those are the 6 exemptions. Now we're going to talk about non-exempt employees. And we're going to talk about 5 key concepts today. First, what is the work week? Let's just clear this up right now. It's a 7-day period, 7 24-hour days that starts here at UTMB from Saturday at midnight through Friday. All right? It's always Saturday through Friday. There aren't any departments that do it differently. Other places you've worked may have been on a different 7-day schedule, but that's not something that's flexible at UTMB. You sort of choose your work week and you stick with it for a long time. It's possible to change it someday, but that's it. That's the period of time we have here. You can't sort of show up and say, I have a better idea for a 7-day period. It's just not going to change, okay? And it's 7 days. It's not 14 days. It's not 28 days. I hear people tell me that all the time. Maybe it's 15, not 14. It's 7. We're going to talk about what activity is work. We're going to spend a lot of time on that. We're going to talk about what I meant by the regular rate, sort of mysterious term. I'm going to talk about some red flags I look for with regards to payroll and timekeeping, red flags that HR and legal and payroll and you ought to look for with regards to the managers that you supervise and the employees. Then we're going to talk about some of the key timekeeping rules that come out of these 2 policy documents. So let's first start with work. What is work? Unfortunately, Congress didn't think to actually tell us that when they passed the Fair Labor Standards Act. So we've had to figure it out through court cases and regulations, but we've come up with a fairly standard set of rules, and we'll talk about those rules. The first is, though, that anything that is suffered or permitted by the employer is compensable. When I say the word compensable, I mean it's work that has to be paid for. And I really have 3 lines up here that describe that. The first is work that is requested by you or required by you, right? That's easy. We have to pay it. No surprise there. But what about work that's not requested, but permitted? We don't directly tell our employees to do every task they engage in a given day. We might even have some managers in here that don't really know what their employees do, right, all day long. Somehow the job gets done. We're not quite sure how they do it, right? There's some of that here. So we permit that work. We don't request it because, frankly, we don't know what to request. That has to be paid too. And then finally, work the employer knows or has reason to believe is being performed, even if not expressly requested. So, you're walking through your office. It's 5 o'clock. 5:05, let's say. You're wandering by, and you look around, you see someone in a cubicle batting on their computer. As you walk by, you think to yourself, I wonder why they're still at the desk. You think, right, I'm going to turn around, stop, I'm going to go look. And then you're thinking about your overtime budget. You just got yelled at. And you're like, nah, I'd rather not know. I'm going to pretend I didn't even see someone sitting there. That way no one's going to blame me, right? I didn't know they were working. The standard under the Fair Labor Standards Act is work that you knew or you should have known. So as managers and supervisors in this room, we're responsible for knowing whether our employees are working, even if we don't see it. We've got to figure it out. For some of us, that's hard to do. Some it's easy, right? You know whether they're all right there with you. You know whether they're working or not. But there's some folks in here that are probably saying, look, I have plausible deniability. I'm not really in a place to monitor what my employees do all day long. Well, I'm here to tell you, right, it's your responsibility to know whether your employees are working. And you have to put controls in place. You have to have ways to understand what your employees are doing. Whether they're actually coming in at 8 o'clock when you scheduled, or whether they're coming in a little before. Whether they're staying late, or they're leaving on time. Everyone in this room is responsible for that. And one thing these policies make clear is the responsibility for proper timekeeping does not just fall on the employees. It falls on all of you too. Okay? So when should employees be paid for? How do we measure the workday? Well, we do it under the concept of a whistle to whistle. You're paid from the first whistle of the day to the last whistle. Well, that's a cute phrase, but what does that really mean? Well, it means the first principal activity to the last principal activity. Well, what does a principal activity mean? It's an activity that is integral or indispensable, part of the employee's work. Okay? And that work can be at UTMB. That workday can start out in the field somewhere. It can start at the house. It can end anywhere too. And we'll talk about how to figure out when the continuous workday starts and stops. And to do that, right, we have to look at what time did the employee perform the first principal work activity of the day. Now, this is easy. You pull up in the parking lot, you climb out of the car, you go to the workstation, right? You clock in, you turn on the computer, you go, right? Arrival at the workstation, turn on your computer, that's the first principal activity of the day. Well, what happens when you, the manager, pick up the phone and call the employee that morning while they're still at the house getting ready? Hey, I wanted to remind you about 2 or 3 things this morning. I had one errand for you to run before you come in today. Has the first whistle blown? Right? Come on, you can play along, right? Have we started the continuous workday? All right. So, regardless of where that employee is, when that employee works, right, not just asked to work or directed to work, but permitted to work, or there's an expectation that the employee is going to work, or you should have known the employee was working. Maybe you sent the employee a flurry of emails at 4 in the morning. There's probably some of you in here, like me, that find the best time to sort of get your work done is like at 2 in the morning at the kitchen table, and you sort of clear your emails for the day. Anybody send emails late at night? Yeah, okay. So you're thinking to yourself, I just need to clear all these emails. You're going to send them out to employees that you expect employees are going to read when they come to work, right? But some of those employees, right, have access to email at home, and maybe they read the email. Maybe they open it up, they start working at home. You've never outlined your expectations to your employees about this. So employees are returning your emails. Well, now there's a record of work being done, right? Because we have an email trail that's going to be saved forever. Okay? So think about that conceptually. Where do your employees start their work? And where do they end their work? Right? Did you send them an email late at night? Did they call you? Did you call them? Did you send them home with a report? Did they say, don't worry, it'll be done in the morning, and you just sort of closed your eyes about how it was possibly going to get done? It's after 5 and the employee's already left? Okay. The bookends of the day, the beginning and the end. We're going to talk about work in more detail, and I have 8 categories here we're going to go through. Meal and rest breaks, waiting time, on-call time, training, travel time, pre- and post-shift activities, sleep time. Yes, you can work and sleep and get paid at the same time. I'll explain how. That's my favorite thing to do. Then we're going to talk about work and like sort of grievances and suggestion systems and meetings and charitable activities. How does it work there too? Sort of the curious issues with regards to work time. So let's talk about meal and rest breaks. First is that the Fair Labor Standards Act doesn't require a meal break or a rest break. Great news, right? You don't have to give breaks to anyone. How about that? You probably should. UTMB certainly encourages you to give employees breaks when you can. But those breaks, the meal breaks, don't have to be paid. All right? And a meal break has to be 30 minutes or more and uninterrupted. If the break is 20 minutes or less, it has to be paid for. So I told a session a couple of weeks ago about an employee that I saw twice in one day standing out in the street smoking a cigarette. Same place, same cigarette, maybe the same cigarette, I don't know. And I was thinking to myself, that's a lot of breaks, right? They're probably all short. They're all paid for. Right? So if you have employees that you give 27 and a half breaks to for various things, all paid if they're under 20 minutes. Okay? 30 minutes or longer, right? The employee has to clock out, take a 30-minute or more uninterrupted break, and then clock back in. There are some departments at UTMB that have an automatic deduction of time for a lunch break. Those are all going to come to an end at UTMB. So if you have a department that does that, in the coming weeks, that practice will end. Employees will have to physically punch out and then physically punch back in. All right? Now, you can require that the employee stay around for the lunch break, but it has to be uninterrupted. Now, what happens if you interrupt the break? You have to pay them. You have to pay the employee if you interrupt them. Now, let's say an employee gets paid $20 an hour, okay? So that means a half hour at time's worth $10. Since they're probably going to be working overtime if their break's interrupted, let's say it's $15. So if you interrupt them, that's $15. I want you to think about your interruptions or your supervisor's interruptions of the employees. And every time you make that interruption, it's costing you $15. Now look, you're in the emergent care business, right? I mean, you're in the business of saving lives. So there are times people ought to be interrupted, right? We're going to give good care here. But you need to value that, right? You need to think about, right? Am I interrupting this employee for a reason that's worth the $15 it's cost him? And I taped a session for employees just a few weeks ago, and I told the employees, if you're interrupted, you need to make sure you get paid. So the employees are going to know that they ought to be paid for interrupted breaks. So if you have an employee sitting at his desk with a sandwich in his mouth, and you walk in and you're like, hey, can you run that report for me? And the employee says, actually, I'm on my break. I'm on my break. Can I do it in 15 minutes? Don't roll your eyes and stomp out of the office, right? Fine. I guess you're not a team player. I know there's some of you in here, right? Someone's pointing at someone else, right? I know there's someone in here that does that. I've told them to tell you that. Okay? I've told them to be open and honest with you about their breaks. So you should politely respond, either, I'd be happy to come back, without any eyes rolling around in your head. Or you say, look, I understand this is an unusual situation, but I do need to have you come back right now. We'll get you paid for this break. Okay? Interrupted breaks are paid breaks. Employees get 30 minutes or more. Okay? So about waiting time. It's a little bit like break time in a way. And I have two really confusing concepts up here. One is that employees have to be paid for time they're engaged to be waiting, but not for time they're waiting to be engaged. I mean, those are really silly little phrases that someone came up for. Frankly, the Department of Labor puts them in their little FAQs. Nobody really knows what that means. I didn't really know what it meant, but I'll give you a story about how I figured it out. So I know this is obvious, but I used to be in the Mexican food business. I was really good with chips and sopapillas. Anyway, I owned this El Chico restaurant. Have you ever heard of El Chico? Any El Chico? It's kind of dead down here. Anyway, I was like this very aggressive, bottom line oriented manager, a real jerk of a guy actually. And I had this idea about saving labor. And I would bring all my waiters in early. They were all scheduled at 11 o'clock. But as all you know, when you go to a restaurant at 11 o'clock, is it busy? No, it's empty. Except sometimes you've probably seen that little table of waiters all hanging out together. That was me, right? We always had a table of waiters. I told them to come in, go get some chips and some salsa and have a soda and wait. And when a customer comes in, I'll call you one at a time. You just come and take care of the customer. That way I always had someone ready to go. Until one time the Department of Labor came in. They're like, Mr. Jordan, that'll be $35,000. And I was beside myself. And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, you have all those people up there waiting and they're not being paid. I said, not being paid, they're getting chips and a soda. And the Department of Labor was like, nah, they're working for you. You told them to be there at 11, they're there at 11. They have been engaged to wait. All right? Do you understand the difference now? Right? Had I told the waiters, look, I want you at 11, and they show up at 11, I'm like, you know what? I don't need you right now. We're too slow. I'll see you back at 11:30. If I had told the waiters that, and they'd go off to TJ Maxx or wherever, and they'd just come back, that would have been fine. But I made them sit there at that table, table 101, eating their chips, waiting on me. That's engaged to be waiting. If you tell your employees to come in 15 minutes early so that they're on time, maybe you have the problem late employee, and you're like, look, late employee, just come in 10 minutes early. You'll never be late. Well, now you've got to pay the employee an extra 10 minutes because you've engaged them to wait. About on-call time for a minute. You know, we're kind of in the on-call business a little bit here, right? We have people we don't want to have to pay money to, but we need to be on standby in case something happens. And on-call time is not compensable, generally. But it can be compensable if one of these 4 factors is met. Do you require the employee to stay on the premises or close by? Hey, you're on call on Saturday, you can just go sit in the cafeteria all day. Compensable, right? Hey, I need you to just hang out either at the Jack in the Box or the Piggly Wiggly downtown, but you need to be close enough to get here in a few minutes. Compensable. We got to pay for it. Hey, we need you to be here in 5 minutes. My policy is, Mr. Employee, when I call, you better be here in 5 minutes. Probably compensable. 30 minutes? Maybe not. 5 minutes? Yeah. Maybe they're on call and you call them 3, 5, 7, 10 times. You require them to come in every single day they work on call. Maybe compensable. Now, just because you require someone to wear a pager, carry a phone, be accessible, check their email once an hour, not necessarily compensable. Now, UTMB does have some departments that actually pay for on-call time. One of the reasons you might do that if you're UTMB is because you have some concerns that you need employees to be more responsive than just sort of whatever, the ability to have the freedom to use their own time. And if you have employees who are not paid for on-call time, but you need them in such a way that you might violate one of these factors, you should work with payroll and HR to see if there's a way to come up with a compensable pay plan or change the factors that are on here in favor of the employee. But training time for a minute. Generally, training time, meeting time like this, when all the employees watch the presentation I taped for them a few weeks ago, that is paid time. It's compensable. The only way it's not compensable is if every one of these factors is met. Right? The attendance has to be outside the regular working hours. If you require an employee to do something during their work time, during their regularly scheduled hours, compensable. If it's voluntary, that is, if you require it, you got to pay for it. Has to be really voluntary. Not like pretend voluntary, like technically this is voluntary, but I kind of need you to go. I mean, it's up to you. I mean, it's kind of on your employee evaluation, but seriously, I mean, it's up to you. Really, it's up to you. But I mean, I do have a list, right? Right? Again, with the eye rolling and the temper tantrums, right? It's all going to be whether it's really voluntary. And there are lots and lots and lots of lawsuits where people argue about whether it's voluntary or not. Think about how loosey-goosey that is, right? Did you throw your head around and thrash when you told the employee it was voluntary? I mean, did you roll your eyes? Did you stomp away? Was there innuendo? Did you retaliate against him for not doing it? Really hard. So voluntary means really, really, really voluntary. The training can't be job related. So if they're going to CPR training and they need CPR to do their job, right, compensable. Now, if it's maybe a skills class for a job they want, maybe a promotion they'd like to have, this is part of their ongoing training to get there, not necessarily compensable, so long as it's voluntary and outside regular working hours. And so long as you're not performing any productive work during the training. All right? About travel time for a minute. Let's start with the basic premise that driving to and from work is not paid work. Right? Even if you drive an hour to work. Anybody have an hour commute? Oh, a whole lot of you. Not compensable. It's just not, right? By the way, if your employee read an email at the kitchen table, what do you think happens to that commute time? It's compensable, right? Remember the whistle blew before they got in the car. Now the commute's compensable. Now the employee gets to get paid for the commute time. Don't give employees that opportunity. How expensive is that? Right? Paying their commute every day because you're allowing them to read emails in the morning? By the way, I told the employees in the training, hey, if you do work in the morning before you come to work, then that commute's compensable. So they know that. Right? So you as managers and supervisors, again, need to make crystal clear to your employees, or those of you that maybe don't have your own non-exempt employees, but you have supervisors that work for you, make sure they're sending this message. Employees should not work at home. Because it's not just the time at home that's compensable now, it's all of that commute time. Okay? Really expensive problem, right? I mean, I don't. You guys don't care about budgets here, right? No budget issues. No one measures your bottom line. No. Right? I mean, money matters here, right? Money matters. Where you're at matters. You can't afford to have significant variances in labor costs. The time between job sites in a day, between those two whistles, is compensable. So you're here at Galveston, now you got to go to Huntsville, now you got to go to Angleton and back. All that travel is compensable, right? Everyone get that? And it's compensable except for what your normal commute time would be. Overnight travel, so let's say you have to be in Dallas. You leave work at 5 o'clock. It's your normal quitting time. You get on the interstate, you get to Dallas. Stay overnight for the meeting the next morning. If that travel takes place after normal working hours, then it's not work. It has to be paid for. If that travel takes place during the normal working hours, then it is work. So if the employee leaves early, gets on the highway and goes, and their normal working hours is till 5 o'clock, that means they get paid up until 5 and everything after is not paid. Everyone understand that? Okay. Let me talk about a company vehicle for a minute. If you happen to drive a company vehicle and you're driving it home at night, that doesn't make it compensable work. It's still unpaid work. Particularly if the use of the vehicle is voluntary. It's a normal commuting vehicle. You don't have to pay for the maintenance of the car, and the commute is within the normal commuting distance to the office. There's no prohibition to not paying an employee for driving that company vehicle to and from the house. But if they're driving the ambulance to the house and back, right? It's not a normal commuting vehicle. Or you tell them they got to bring the car home because they may have to be dispatched somewhere else, then it could be compensable. It's no longer voluntary. About pre- and post-shift activities for a minute. An employee shouldn't do anything until they clock in. Got it? The minute they clock in, they can start work. But your rule must be you don't do anything until you clock in. And by the way, you don't do anything after you clock out. Nothing. Not this, well, look, I want to make sure the time clock looks good, and I don't want to make it look like I was working overtime. I just needed to wrap up one quick project. Nothing. If an employee works off the clock, and the policy makes this clear, that's a violation of policy. And if you allow an employee to work off the clock, it's a violation of policy. And we've told employees that they're subject to discipline if they do that. And the policy makes clear that you're subject to discipline for allowing employees to do that. So working off the clock, either before or after you clock out, is a problem. But reading emails before work, people tell me, oh, I was just trying to catch up on my email before my day actually started. Right? We all know, is that a principal activity, indispensable to the work? Yes, the whistle blew, you should be clocked in. So when you see that as managers, that's a red flag to you. Nope, sorry, that's not the way it works. Counsel the employee, pay them for the time they were there, and make sure it doesn't happen again. How about shift change conversations for a minute? I mean, we're in the business that requires some departments to have a handoff, right? I mean, one employee has to tell another employee what's going on. Shift change conversations are compensable. And I've had this conversation with the Department of Labor. They know there's a handoff, but employee A left at 5 o'clock and employee B came on at 5 o'clock. And they know there's a 10-minute shift change conversation. How did that happen? We don't want to be in the position to say, oh, we really didn't do the shift change conversation. That's bad for other reasons, right? We have no idea what's going on with that patient. We just walk in. Right, so we know there's dialogue that we require to have occur in some of our departments. And if we have that dialogue, our time records need to show that. So you need to bake that into your schedules. You need to bake in that time. Bake that into your budgets. We know it takes 5 minutes. We know it takes 10 minutes. Bake that in. Because it's a red flag to me. It's a red flag to HR and payroll. It ought to be a red flag to you. And the Department of Labor is looking for it. Okay? Other types of work, donning and doffing. Donning, putting on stuff. Doffing, taking off stuff. Now, some donning and doffing is not work, like putting on your steel-toed boots, putting on your scrubs at home. But when you get to work and you got to put on the hazmat suit for some reason, with the big fancy hat, right? That would be compensable work. Because you can't put the hazmat suit on and jump on the bus to come to work, right? The rule is, and I'll show you the slide on this in a second, the rule is if you have to do it at work and you can't do it at home, it's usually compensable with regards to uniforms. So what's not work? Waiting to punch the time clock, not work. Standing in line. And I hear this all the time. We wait in line, and Susie is the slowest person ever to clock in, and she knows how to do it. She's been here 25 years, and she can't get on, and we're right behind her. We should be paid. No. Right? Waiting in line is not compensable. Now, it might be a problem, right? Susie's got a problem we got to fix, because we need people to be at work on time. Going through security is not work. So if you're up at Huntsville doing a project, right, you got to get into the prison, get to the clinic. All that security is not work. Walking from the parking lot to the workstation. Some of you have a long walk. Some of your employees have to walk a long way. And they want to be paid for that time, but they're not going to be paid. It's not compensable time. Now, if you put the time clock by the parking lot, then you're going to pay for the walk, right? So the rule is you pay people when they get to the workstation. So don't have the clock out system somewhere away from the workstation, because now you're going to pay for the walk, right? Now, if you tell an employee, look, every day before you get to the workstation, I need you to stop by the president's office and pick up a report. Is the whistle blown before they've clocked in? Right, so you're going to pay them for part of their walk, because now they got to do what they call a frolic and detour, right? They got to go somewhere else to do something. Here's the donning and doffing slide I was telling you about. Putting on clothes that are required to be worn at work is work. Waiting in line for a uniform that you have to put on at work is work. If it's just like putting on you got to put your earplugs in, that's all you have to do, or you have to put on your hairnet, that generally is not compensable to the extent it's de minimis. It's just not very much time. So let's talk about suggestion systems. Meetings where you meet with employees to talk about things that are going good or bad. Those are all compensable. Resolving grievances, meeting with HR, all compensable. Why? Because those activities really aren't voluntary. When HR calls and says, hey, we need Johnny to come meet with us, you think Johnny feels like he can be like, nah, I'm cool. Right? It's not voluntary. Or when you say, Johnny, get over there. Now, you're going to have to pay for that time. Even if it's outside working hours, even if you say, look, you can go after your shift ends, still compensable. So if I were you, I'd send them over there during their shift, right? Because I don't want to eat the overtime. What about the employees that you need to go help you make sandwiches down at the church? Right? Or put together bikes for Christmas. Does that work? I mean, could it be, right? See my rules up here. Is it voluntary? Is it really voluntary? If you're the employee, look, we're all employees. When your boss comes to you and says, can you help me on Saturday put together bikes for a really good cause? I know evaluations are next week. Can you come and help me, please? Right? You're like, oh, man. Or he doesn't even tell you evaluations. He just kind of goes, right, you know he's thinking about it. So it's this issue of voluntariness again. If you ask employees to do things in the community, things that are like volunteerish, hey, can you run the 5K with me? It'll be fun. That sounds really voluntary, but to the employee, they feel compelled, right? When the president of UTMB asks you to run a fun run with them, who's saying no? Raise your hand. I'll run with you. That's the one guy. He's like, I'm not doing it. Right? You're going to be like, okay, I'll walk next to you. Okay? It's hard to do that stuff and keep it voluntary. So I want you to think about these issues when you work with employees in any sort of volunteer capacity. It really, really has to be voluntary. And it has to occur outside normal working hours. Okay? Sleep time. Sleep time you can actually be paid for. But we're going to make sure they're not. And here's how. Now, how does that come up here? There's probably some people in here that have been around when hurricanes have swept through, right? And you guys are in the business of providing medical care, and you can't always leave, right? And we got to wait it out. We got a brick building. So sometimes, right, you tell your staff, look, I need you just to come and stay here. We can't evacuate the island. You got to stay here. You're going to be here for 48 hours. We'll have a place for you to sleep. But you don't have to pay them for all 24 hours. So long as you give them 8 hours of time off, 5 hours of which allows them to sleep. The sleep's not interrupted. And then you have sleeping facilities. So when you're budgeting in the middle of a hurricane, trying to figure out what to do, just remember you don't always have to pay for the entire 24-hour period. There is a sleep time component that you can carve out. But otherwise, you get paid for sleeping. Let's talk about some red flags. Now, when I talk about red flags, I don't want you to think, hey, this is just what I'm looking for. This is what HR and payroll and compliance and legal and all of you should be looking for. I mean, you're really the front line here on compliance. And so for those of you that are higher up than a frontline supervisor, it's what you also need to be looking for in your managers and your supervisors. Because all of these red flags are things that the DOL is looking for. The DOL walks in and they look for all of these things. I'm bombarded by these issues every single day by the DOL. The first is that the punch time by the employee is always a nice round number. That can't happen. There's always like a 9:01, an 8:58, an 8:59. It's not precise every day. If it's precise every day, someone's not doing it right. If the time they clock in always matches the recorded time that they're scheduled, and they clock out matches their scheduled time, someone's not doing it right. Someone's playing the system, right? Someone's making adjustments in order to true up the time with the schedule. Maybe they're shaving time. Maybe they're just being negligent and their employees don't get it right. They can never get clocked in and out right, and we're fixing it. But instead of fixing it to the actual minute, we're just fixing it to the precise hour. So either we're being negligent or being intentionally deceptive. If the records show a whole number of missed punches, I mean, all of these timekeeping systems, as you can imagine, have very profound audit trails. I mean, we can figure out exactly what happened and when, and what they had for breakfast before they did it. Right? And you can too. Hey, payroll, can you help me with an audit trail because something's fishy here? Can you help me look into this? Right? It's there. And if we have a whole number of missed punches and changes and historical edits, then either we have people playing games with the system or we have people that aren't doing their job correctly. Right? They're being negligent. And in both situations, right, the employees are accountable. And so they should be counseled. In both situations, you're responsible. And you will ultimately be held accountable for big problems. One of the reasons we put together this policy, these policies, is to reduce the time and expense and effort that payroll has to go through every single payroll period to fix problems with time punches. And so ultimately, these policies are put in place to make sure that you're accountable and the employees are accountable for what payroll has to fix every pay period. Another red flag, the time punches don't match the hours worked on the payroll records. That's weird. They were paid for 7 hours, but they punched 7.5. It's a red flag we look for. What about employees in the workplace after we've clocked in or clocked out or during their lunch break? You ought to, as managers, walk around and say, hey, what's Susie doing here? It's like 10 minutes after the shift is over. You know, remember, you're an exempt employee. A lot of you are. So your job doesn't end at 5 o'clock, right? Your job ought to end like at 5:05. Are employees really doing what they're supposed to be doing when they clock out? You should be engaged in those sort of detailed self-audits of what's going on in your workplace. When you allow the employee to take lunch at his desk, do you actually pay attention to whether the employee is answering phone calls or catching up on work? I know a lot of employees, including here at UTMB, who have very complex metrics they're measured by, see lunch as the perfect opportunity to catch up and not get penalized. I'm not going to tell anybody I'm working, but this is a great time to get that report done. Do you know whether they're doing that? Shouldn't you know? I mean, UTMB will say, look, you should have known they were working on those reports because you ought to pay attention to what's happening during your lunch break. Okay? Let's talk about the regular rate for a minute. It's a sort of mysterious term I was talking about earlier. The Fair Labor Standards Act says you pay 1.5 times the regular rate, not the hourly rate. What does that mean? Well, it means we take all the compensation, all the remuneration that an employee receives, and that goes on the top of the fraction. We divide it by all of the hours worked, and that gives us a number. And if we pay something in addition to the hourly rate, then that rate that comes out of that fraction will be higher than the hourly rate. And so what kind of things can be included in the top of that fraction? Well, certainly all the hourly wages. But commissions, if we pay those, non-discretionary team awards or bonuses or other sorts of performance payments, shift differentials, job differentials, on-call pay, all that drives up the rate, makes the regular rate higher than the hourly rate. What's not included? Employee benefits, payment for time not worked. What's an example of time not worked? Sick leave, right? You get paid, but you didn't do a thing. That doesn't go on the top of the fraction. Per diems, expense reimbursements, Christmas bonuses. You guys get big Christmas bonuses here, I know. Right? If you did, it wouldn't be included anyway. Discretionary bonuses. That's excluded from that fraction. Why do I tell you this? Because payroll does the math. I tell you this because I just want you to understand, right, how the math works. So when you're thinking about ways to deal with compensation and model new performance metrics, think about how that might affect your overall overtime bonus. It's not just multiplying the hourly rate. There's more to it. As I mentioned, non-work pay, something to think about. Vacation pay, sick pay, holiday pay, those hours don't count towards your 40 hours. So, if you took vacation on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and then you work Thursday and Friday, and your manager asks you to come in on Saturday and work another 8 hours, right? Do we have to pay the employee overtime? And no, right? No, because the employee didn't work 40 hours. They're going to get paid for 48, but they only worked 24. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. You have to work the 40 hours to get the premium pay for hours worked over 40. Let's talk about some timekeeping rules that come out of the policies that we have. The first is that managers and timekeepers are accountable for approving time every single pay period. Okay? The employees, of course, are accountable, and we say it in the policy, and we told them during the session I taped. But you're responsible too. So if there's an error, right, the employee's responsible, but you are too. We are no longer going to have, I mentioned this a minute ago, automatic deductions, right? People have to clock in and clock out. No more automatic deductions, and that's going to be coming very soon for those of you that still do it. If we have an interrupted break, this is clear in the policy. An interrupted break is a paid break. Questions, email, calls, paid breaks. If we have an employee that works overtime in that 7-day period, it has to be paid in that period. No comp time for non-exempt employees. Period. No like, oh, they worked extra this week, I'll just let them work less next week, and it'll all wash out. That's a big no-no. Okay? They work it that week, they're paid for it that week. All right? Now, the last bullet point, right? Non-approved overtime has to be paid. So, you can discipline the employee for working non-approved overtime. Fire them. You're fired. You're paid, but you're fired. I would, HR would be like, don't fire them. Just write them up. Counsel them. Maybe that's the right thing to do, right? But ultimately, you need to counsel your employees and hold them accountable for doing things they're not supposed to do, including working off the clock or working unapproved overtime, but you have to pay them. You have to pay them, okay? Your only recourse is counseling, discipline, up to and including termination. UTMB were required to keep accurate records, and the two policies that you'll see both make this clear. We do not want a bunch of historical edits. We want time to be accurately corrected during the pay period, before that particular payroll is paid. You have to be vigilant as managers in getting adjustment forms completed properly. The courts, the Department of Labor, they will always believe the employee. So if we don't have an accurate time record, we lose. When the employee comes to me and says, or goes to the Department of Labor and says, I worked 120 hours that week. The Department of Labor says, oh, whatever, we'll go get the time card. And they come to me and they say, where's the time card? I'm like, there's no time card. We don't have one. The Department of Labor says, oh, 120 hours it is. That's in the law. The law says that. So we need accurate records. We strongly encourage you to get it right during the pay period. There is a historical edit process, and you'll see that in the policy. We can go back and fix old payrolls. But that reflects negatively on you. Okay? Don't let that be lost on you. Now, there's certain situations you just can't fix, right? An employee disappears, they go on leave, it's going to have to be historically edited. We get that. There's going to be situations you can't control, you've got to call payroll. They're more than happy to answer questions and help you. But over time, historical edits are disfavored. The key, right, is that as managers, you have to be very responsive to employee requests. You can't let this stuff stack up. You've got to deal with it immediately. And I know that's hard because you have real jobs, right? And dealing with some of these administrative issues is difficult. But if you get on top of them today, that's really going to solve a lot of problems for UTMB. All the time is managed through Kronos. One key point to make here is you must obtain employee approval for all time adjustments. And to be sure, employees have to validate their time cards. That is, they have to attest to its accuracy. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But the final point on this slide is that time has to be recorded for the date it was worked. So to avoid the historical edit sort of flag, don't just give them time in the next pay period. I'll just give you 8 hours tomorrow, pretend you worked. No fake days. You have to go back and fix it the right way. All right? Let's talk about the timekeeping attestation that your non-exempt employees are going to attest to. Every single pay period, they're going to attest to the accuracy of their time. And this is what they're going to be saying in their attestation. One, that all of the employee leave has been entered correctly. All the sick leave, all the vacation, a holiday, all entered correctly. They're going to say that the employee time card has not been altered without their consent. They're going to say that they've been paid for every single meal period that was interrupted and for which they didn't receive the full duration. And they're going to say they're being paid for they've reported all hours worked everywhere. At home, at a UTMB facility, anywhere they've performed job-related activities. Every pay period, they're going to attest to this. And you can see how that's helpful to us, right? Because now we can go back to the Department of Labor and say, hey, look what they signed off on. I know they said 120 hours, but look, right here, they signed off on it. But we have to do our part, right? We have to do our part to make those attestations stick. Let me end with a discussion about complaints and retaliation. We told all the employees when I taped this a few weeks ago, if you have a problem with any of this, if you feel like you've been subjected to any of this, talk to your managers. Call payroll, call HR. Make a complaint if you have to. But raise these issues so that we can fix it. And I'm going to get on my soapbox for just a second. When employees make complaints, maybe they suggest that my manager has winked and nodded about this idea of me working off the clock. He knows it happens, but we have a special deal. And now you're being accused of something bad. And you're being very defensive, right? You're feeling defensive. We've all been there. We can all feel it right now as I'm talking about it. You have just been accused of doing something very bad. And now you're freaked out because you've had this job for 25 years. And you're scared. And you're really worried about it. I want you to act just the opposite. Okay? Because when you act just the opposite, it allows UTMB to accurately figure out what's going on. It allows us to help train the employees and you about how to do it properly going forward. It allows us to get comfortable with the idea that you're not going to be so defensive that you retaliate against the employee. Right? When you open your kimono, right, and you become vulnerable to this idea, and you listen, it's better for everyone. I know you want to be defensive. I've been there. I've talked to hundreds of managers in these situations. And the first thing they do is be defensive, and it makes everything worse. Listen. You don't have to admit to anything. Just listen. Open your mind. Okay? Consider for the possibility that the way things were being done in the past may not have been completely accurate. But we can all improve. And I'll give you one last anecdote. Retaliation is not just something like the employee complained about me and I fired him. The employee complained about me, so I demoted him. The employee complained about me, so I gave him I gave him a bad job assignment. It's much softer than that. I had a case where an employee had made a complaint about wages, and the manager was like, well, I'm not going to retaliate against him. Don't worry, David. I'm not that kind of manager. And then the Christmas party came along, and it was going to be lobster. And so when the employee showed up to sit down at the table and get lobster, he found out he was at the kids' table where there was spaghetti. No lobster, spaghetti only. What happened? It turned into a federal lawsuit. I argued about spaghetti in federal court. Right? And you know what? It was retaliation. It was real retaliation. And it sounds silly. It sounds stupid. right? But all of us in this room, right, have thought, look, I'm not going to be obvious, but I'm going to get back at that guy some way. He's going to know. I'm going to hurt him. He's getting spaghetti. Okay? So when you're thinking about retaliation, I just want you to think about that. Am I giving this guy spaghetti? I'm ignoring him. He's not getting a plum assignment. I'm not taking him to lunch anymore. Whatever you did before and now it's different, don't give him spaghetti. Protect the institution and protect yourself. That's all I have. Does anybody have any questions? All right. One back here in the back.
All right, we have representatives from HR, payroll, and legal to answer questions along with David. And please speak into the microphone because we are recording this and our remote viewers need to hear it. Where did you go? There you are.
So if an employee is on vacation and they tell you, you know, they're available if you have a question or anything to just call them, so you're saying we cannot call them?
So that's a good question. If it's
Like just to answer a question, like if we're looking for something or, you know, something like that.
If it's work, right, you should pay them for that time, right? If you're going to call them and make them give you 15 minutes of time on a work issue, it's work. If you're calling to see if they're available to come in next week, that's not work, right? But if it's really a work-related issue, then you should pay them. Yeah. Other questions? There's one back here in the back.
Here's one.
Sorry. You have an employee that's breastfeeding and she needs to pump 4 times during her daily shift.
Yeah.
Can you not ask her for one of those pump sessions to be on her lunch hour?
I wouldn't. I mean, I just don't think, there's so many other sort of sensitive related issues associated with that I would leave it be. It's just not going to last that long. I mean, could you? Probably, technically you could, but it just creates a whole host of other problems. So I wouldn't do that, but I appreciate the question. There's 2 over here, 1 up there. Okay.
Yes. What are the maximum number of hours an employee can work consecutively?
24.
They can actually work 24 consecutive hours?
Yeah.
They really can't?
Yes. There's
Okay.
no
I
requirement.
just asked you twice. I wanted to make sure that was the case.
There's no requirement under the law. Now, it may not be prudent to work someone 24 hours straight, right? I mean, we're in the business of providing quality care, quality service, and we have, I think, a fundamental understanding of what's too long to work someone. So we shouldn't do that, but yeah, there's no requirement under the law.
Yeah, it was a fantastic presentation. The slides were really good, and I enjoyed it, and I'm glad I came over. Okay.
Thank you.
But, you know, we are sitting here, and I'm seeing the vice president of research. I'm seeing, many leaders. Can you give us a seminar one day when you justify why these leaders are exempt?
Oh, so
Okay,
why
because-
they're exempt from overtime?
Why they exempt? Because
Yeah.
these guys are moved the university.
Yeah.
They are moving the university, and they will. Okay. So why
Yeah, why are they
the
exempt from
vice
overtime?
president is exempt?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Look, when they passed the Fair Labor Standards Act during the Depression era, they were worried about putting low-wage earners back to work. So during the Depression era, it wasn't high-wage earners, it wasn't professionals, it wasn't managers that were having problems, right? It was the low-wage earners that were on the street that couldn't get a job. So the Fair Labor Standards Act has always been crafted to serve low-wage earners. In fact, there's another exemption we didn't talk about. There's an exemption called the highly compensated exemption. And it says, look, if you're paid more than $100,000 a year, we don't even really want to bother with you, okay? And that's because the law was really written for a different group of people. So should the professionals in the room and those that are working all the hours, should they all get paid more and be paid overtime? Sure, but the law is just not written for them, right? Could you individually contract with your employer to increase your pay because you think you're more valuable? Yes, but the law doesn't require it. Okay, good question.
I have a very quick one. What happened to the 25-minute break?
It's like sort of where's the middle, right?
Right. No, you said the minus less than 20
Yeah,
paid,
Yeah.
more than 30 It's okay, no
Yeah.
pay. What happened to the 25
I'll
minutes?
tell you what, that's a great, I asked the same question to the Department of Labor all
Oh,
the
really?
time.
Oh, okay.
It's really, I appreciate you being intuitive enough to notice that, right? That's the big gray area that hundreds of lawyers and hundreds of HR people ask all the time. And the only takeaway I can really tell you is to be safe, 20 or less pay, 30 or more, don't pay. The middle is just like no man's land. Don't mess around in there and you won't get in trouble. Okay? That's all. I wish I had a better answer. We got someone back in the back running.
I have two questions, and they're probably for payroll. How will those pay rules be changed? Is that going to be a programmatic thing? Is payroll going to run a script that will change all of the pay rules, or will departments need to make a change to the pay rules? Is my first question.
You have an answer to that?
We're going to have to get James down to Harry's going to answer. Thank you.
Carol, it's my understanding that payroll will be running those changes, systematic changes.
Great. Do we have a timeline?
I don't, but if you have questions about your department, you should call your payroll rep.
Okay. And the second question is on that 20-minute interrupted break. If the employee clocks out, then clocks back in, I just got interrupted, at 19 minutes, is there going to be a programmatic thing in Kronos that tells it to disregard that 19 minutes I didn't work because you're over the 15?
And again, I would talk to payroll directly about how that would happen.
Hang on,
No,
James
it-
has his hand
I
up.
would, we've got somebody here, Carol.
So the 15-minute break, because there's going to be a rounding rule on that 19 minutes. So it's going to round to the time. So it kind of depends on what time they clocked in and what time they clocked out. So it could actually round, I think, looking at it, to the exact same time. So it would be kind of you'd have to look at it.
So programmatically, what will Kronos do with the 25-minute break?
Let's just say avoid the 25-minute break. So for the lunch, for your lunch, right? When they clock in and out for lunch, it doesn't round. It looks at the time, the duration of the lunch. So I would say it's going to treat it like that.
So in that example, and the person's 25, and the recommendation from our lawyer is that you would pay it, that's going to take a manual edit then? Is that correct?
You're asking whether I didn't make a recommendation on what happens at 25.
No.
If that's what you're
That's
asking.
what I'm saying, is at 25, if I clock in and then I'm interrupted at 25 minutes and
All
I
right.
clock in.
Well, I would call that, well, first of all, I'd call that an interrupted meal break. So, yeah.
So, and I think the answer to that is up front, we need to make sure that we're communicating with our employees and with, all employees, not just the non-exempt ones, but the exempt ones as well, to make sure that they're not going up and handing somebody work at like 23 minutes. Make sure that everybody knows that 30-minute lunch needs to be taken.
Any other questions? No? Right?
Oh.
Oh, one more.
Holly's coming right behind you.
If you're made to come, well, not made, sometimes I have to go get paperwork off campus, so I clock in at 7:30 at the off campus. My hours are 8 to 5, I work 40. If on Friday I'm over by 30 minutes, is it okay for my supervisor to say, okay, let's leave at 4:30?
Yeah.
Being that it's going to make those adjustments on Kronos, because you talked about earlier about different times not matching, is that going to raise a red flag?
Yeah, so first of all, the time needs to be accurately recorded in Kronos. Yes, you can send the employee home early in that work week to avoid getting into overtime. Some people call that flexing the employee, right? They're going to stay late one day, leave early another. Two caveats. One, if you have frequent flexing, I would just change the schedule because it demonstrates a lack of control. I don't mean your personal control. I mean there's a control missing with regards to the payroll and the scheduling. So frequent flexing, fix the schedule. The other thing what I've heard from some of your employees, managers here as well about this, is we should not allow employees to self-flex. Or they sort of decide for themselves. They stayed late, they're going to decide to come in late the next day or leave early. Again, shows a lack of fiscal control with regards to your particular department. That's a great question, though. Yes, during that work week, you can avoid your overtime in that 7-day period. Don't sort of have them come in late the next week, right? Or leave early. Okay, good question. Anybody else? Here.
I work in a 24/7 operation, and sometimes we have to, they work different schedules. So when somebody is scheduled and we then need them back, what is the time that needs to be between the shifts? Is there a law? And then what's UTMB's policy?
There's not a law. Do we have a particular policy at UTMB on that issue? So there is, it needs to be a break where they have sort of the significant ability to use their own time. But we take 30-minute breaks and don't pay for that. So my argument has always been 30-minute break or more is a long enough gap to have between shifts. So if you had a 2-hour gap or a 3-hour gap, you're not going to have a problem. Okay? Any other questions? Is that all right? Do we have another one? No? All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I'm up here if you want to come up and holler at me. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
UTMB Health, working together to work wonders.